Today we're going to experiment a little bit with watercolor techniques. If you haven't used watercolors before, there are a few things you may need to know before we get started on our final surrealistic side of our self-portrait. To start off, there is a technique called wet on wet. To do this technique, you should wet your paper, and then you wet the color that you're using. I'm doing this by dipping my brush into the water and then adding that water, letting it drip into the color that I want. As you can see, the wet on wet technique, the color, the pigment tends to spread more. Wet on dry is where I'll take the color and paint the color directly onto the dry surface. As you can see, it doesn't spread as much. A few other cool effects that you may be interested in is the salt effect. You could do this either by first applying the wet on wet technique or the wet on dry. I'm just going to go ahead and do the wet on dry. And so for the salt technique, I've applied my watercolor, and now I'm taking a little dash of salt and I'm going to sprinkle it onto that color. What begins to happen is that the watercolor will want to resist or get away from the salt, so it'll eventually end up making little splotchy marks as it dries. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Another technique, also called a resist, is a wax or crayon resist. So I'm just using a white crayon. You can use any colored crayon. And I'm going to first apply the crayon in any design that I'd like. And then I'm going to apply the watercolor over it. And you can see that the crayon is wanting to resist, hence why this is called a resist, the watercolor. And you can start to see here the splotchy spots for the salt resist. And last but not least, I'm going to do a rubbing alcohol resist. So what you want to do for this one is you want to add your color to the paper first. And then by taking a straw and dipping it into the cup of rubbing alcohol that I have, I'm going to then apply the rubbing alcohol to the spot. And I'm not holding the top of the straw to try to suction the rubbing alcohol or anything. I'm just dipping the straw into my rubbing alcohol cup, and I am placing it on the watercolor. The watercolor will want to resist wherever the rubbing alcohol goes as well. So these are just a few ideas that you may want to keep in mind when completing the surrealistic side of your self-portrait. You may want to use some of these textures or ideas when composing that.